Alright, guys, let's wrap up the 1920s with none other than the Harlem Renaissance. Now, the Harlem Renaissance was a complete transformation in black culture. So we'll talk about the political and, of course, the cultural aspects of the 1920s as relates to the Harlem Renaissance. Now, in terms of political, there is one group that is created by Marcus Garvey, known as the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and it's created in 1914. However, by the mid-1920s, it has over 1 million members. Now, how it differentiated itself from the NAACP was that it advocated an African sense to it. There was an African feel to the group. Now, it had promoted that African Americans even go back to Africa to help to overthrow white colonists, and what it really was reinstilled the sense of black pride, and that the sense that Africa is something that is meaningful in black culture, that Africa is the homeland, and it is something that is to be revered and honored. But unfortunately, what happens with Marcus Garvey is that the movement will lose some steam when he is convicted of mail fraud. While it does make a point of that in the textbook, the more important aspect is that sense of black pride and culture and reverence for Africa does still carry on, and that was something that could only be done thanks to the movement of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. Now, what is the Harlem Renaissance really? Well, defined, it's a literary and artistic and cultural movement celebrating African American heritage. Now, the thing is that what separates it from a lot of art during the time is that it's an accurate reflection of what's going on in these black artists' mind. It's what they experience, it's what they've had to deal with growing up. It's all the horrors of society, what they've had to grow up through, but also the positive nature of it. So again, something that can tie in with both the roaring and dark part of the 1920s is that what was it like to really grow up to dominate, to live in a white-dominated society, and still, what is the creative outlook because of that? Now, some of the noted artists of the time, okay, the writers, the poet Langston Hughes, or Neil Hurston, and Claude McKay, a lot of these artists poured into their hearts and souls what they felt was important to the black experience. And primarily Langston Hughes is a name that we continue to hear to this day as one of the foremost writers of this time period. Now, what a lot of people will remember about the Harlem Renaissance is the prominence of jazz, and that becomes the defining musical genre. It's almost a soundtrack to the entire 1920s. Now, originally, jazz is something created by African Americans in the South, around New Orleans, around the Bayou. It's the combination of that Southern ragtime, but also loud instruments, the trumpet, the bass, the trombone, and also the spoken word. Now, of course, artists that you might have heard of, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and these artists become more popular in the 40s, but they produced a great amount of work during the 1920s, and also the blues soul singer Bessie Smith, who would go on to be the highest selling African American artist, female artist during this time. Now, where would you go for this kind of culture is we think of, well, Harlem, New York, a suburb of Manhattan Island, and you go north of West 125th Street, and you're there in Harlem, the epicenter of all of this movement. And the reason why it's called the Harlem Renaissance is because a lot of these artists live so very close to one another. When Duke Ellington is able to perform just down the street from his home at the Apollo Theater, and then everyone goes out to the Cotton Club later on that night, I mean, that was a real sense of culture, that it was a community, and it wasn't just something that is manufactured. It's not just, people copying each other, but it was a real soulful reflection of what was going on during this period. And with that, I know this is kind of an abridged version of the Harlem Renaissance, but I did want to get this across to you. So, please keep in mind, what the Harlem Renaissance means today. How does it keep going forward? And ultimately, how is it that it's still influencing today? We have so many artists who, have that same sort of style, I mean, that flair, that charisma that really centered in the Harlem Renaissance. So I want you guys to think about that today. This is the final part of the 1920s, and of course we'll move on to the more dark side, which is that of what would later come on in the 1930s. So thank you guys again. I apologize for all the inconvenience due to baseball and everything, but I hope this, guys, has helped you. I hope you all do well on the test, and I will see you next week.